Hello, I'm Seth Vetrano Wilson, and this is Tyndale's Unfinished Revolution, Reconsidering the Translation of Ecclesia. In 1604, King James issued instructions on the translation of the Bible that bore his name. And one of the curious things is that there was only one particular word singled out for how it ought to be translated. That was the Greek word ekklesia. And it said, the old ecclesiastical words to be kept as the word church, not to be translated congregation. So why did King James include this in the instructions for his translation? Let's talk a little bit about the word ekklesia and the background to the translation. So this word ekklesia in Greek is used by pagan Greeks to refer to the public assembly of each city. For example, the famed Athenian democracy, when they would come together to vote on things, that was the ekklesia, coming together to vote on things. It was also used in the Septuagint as a translation of the Hebrew word kahal, which refers to the people of Israel gathering together to meet and to worship. Often it's in the phrase like the kahal of the Lord, the kahal of Israel, things like this. And so this word ecclesia, also like kahal, it's not a specifically religious word. Instead, it's used to refer to any group of people gathered together, but it is often used to refer to the people of God gathering together in worship. So does ekklesia mean church? Let's consider in Tyndale's time and also today. So Tyndale, he wrote that the definition of church, in his mind, the first definition was a place or a building. I think that's also true today. Many people, when they hear the word church, they think of a place, a building. So there's a quote where he refers to that. He also said that in common usage, church made people think of the church leaders, especially in Matthew 18. He says, if they don't listen to you, tell it to the church. He was saying people were understanding that it's referring to the church leaders. And he said, look, it refers to the whole church, the whole congregation, and not just the church leaders who he considered quite problematic and bad in his day, as you can see from that quote. Um, he he also specifically said, no, it's everybody. And he also said it was a general word and not a specifically Christian word. And the evidence, one of the evidences that he gave for that is in Acts 19. I want to read this in full. It says, now, ekklesia is a Greek word and was in use before the time of the apostles and was understood as a congregation among the heathen, where there was no congregation of God or of Christ. And also Luke himself useth ecclesia for a church or congregation of heathen people thrice in one chapter. This is in Acts 19. If you remember, there's this riot in Ephesus, and everybody's mad at Paul and the Christians for losing sales on their idols. So they're chanting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And this is referred to as an ecclesia 3 times. So clearly it doesn't mean a church, although maybe some of your churches, hope not, don't look like that. Anyway, that's an ecclesia. Sir Thomas More was an opponent of Tyndale, and he argued instead that congregation, Tyndale's translation of congregation, was bad, specifically because it lacked the Christian connotation. He said, why use congregation, which word is common to a company of Christian men or a company of Turks, referring, of course, to Muslims. So he's saying, look, we should use a Christian word, not this general word that you can even use for Muslims. He also said, a congregation of Christian people hath been in England always called and known by the name of the church. So he's saying the Christian connotation is a benefit. That's why we want to keep it and not ditch it for a word like congregation, which is more general. He also opposed congregation because it weakened the connection with the Catholic Church, which and the hierarchy, and but especially just the idea of all the visible Catholic Church and its institutional visible aspects, as opposed to Tyndale's idea that it's the people who have faith that are the real ecclesia. He didn't like that idea. They didn't like each other. Tyndale and More really didn't like each other. So here's some issues that come out. Is it clear that church refers to people and not a building? That's a question for both their time and our time. Is the ecclesia all believers or just clergy more specifically? And then finally, is it good that ecclesia, is it a general term or a term for Christians and should be translated with a general term or a specifically Christian term? Now, something that I didn't see Tyndale and More talk about, but I think is a very important theological issue to bring into this, is the fact that ecclesia is also used to refer to the people of Israel in the New Testament twice. So there's Acts 7:38. Moses was in the ecclesia in the desert. In Hebrews 2:12, which is a quote of Psalm 22, verse 22, David says, "In the midst of the ecclesia, I will praise you." These are both getting the Hebrew word kahal, translated as ecclesia in the New Testament. And these are referring to the people of Israel, not to Jesus's time. Now, most translations in English today have a word like assembly or congregation here, but they'll have church almost everywhere else, except for Acts 19 with the rioting pagan mob. They also will not use church, unsurprisingly. And so the question of, is it okay to take a word that often refers to the people of God gathering together in Jesus's time or later, and use this word church in those instances, but then in the instances where it refers to the earlier people of God, to use a totally different word? And what are the implications of that? Let's look a little more at this issue. So the Septuagint, as I mentioned, uses ekklesia for the Hebrew word kahal. Kahal is also a general word for a gathering of people, but it usually refers to the assembly of Israel, the assembly of Yahweh. And so the New Testament use of ekklesia here draws on this connection. It connects the believers in Jesus and Paul's day to those in Moses and David's day. So the word ekklesia is not a Christian term. It's if it's thought of in a religious context, then it includes both people of God before Jesus and the people of God after Jesus. And the use of ecclesia in the New Testament for the people of God is a use drawing on the previous people of God, ecclesia usage already. It's not a new term. And so let's think about this. Is the ecclesia of Israel equal to the ecclesia of Christ? I think, in all fairness, there's both continuity and newness. But the fact that the New Testament uses this same term for ecclesia before and after Jesus, as I've just shown, I think is quite significant. And what's significant is that if you use a word like church, it's like you've got a totally new thing starting, and church is dominated by Gentiles. But yeah, sure, you can get the Jews in there if you want, but like they're if they're not excluded, then they're at least really sidelined. And certainly, by the time of Sir Thomas More, that would have been the case. But if you use another word that is also used in the Old Testament to translate kahal, and is commonly used to refer to the people of Israel gathering together, and if it's the same word used in those two verses in Acts and Hebrews, that also then gets reused to refer to the people that are gathered together in Jesus's day to worship and in our day, then I think you're going to connect that idea more easily. People are going to say, oh, look, what's new about the ecclesia in Jesus's time is not that it's that Gentiles are now included, right? That inclusion is more clear, and the continuity is more clear. Yes, there's a newness, but the newness is the inclusion of the Gentiles, not the exclusion or sidelining of the Jews. The reality is that the English word church just doesn't work for Old Testament assemblies. You can't, talk about Moses in the church in the wilderness. It doesn't. It's anachronistic in modern English. So if you aren't going to use church in the Old Testament, but you use it in the New Testament, you're creating a distinction that simply is not present in the text. So in summary, I would argue, and with Tyndale, but then adding some new ideas, that ecclesia is a people, it's not a place, that ecclesia refers to all believers, not just the clergy, although, of course, the church leaders have an important role in God's people. It refers to God's assembly at all times, not just after Jesus. And it's a general term. It's not an exclusively Christian term, as Acts 19 clearly shows. So why does this matter? I would argue that new readers could easily misunderstand church as referring to buildings. You could say that's something that's easily sorted out, but hey, why? If we don't need to use the word the church, why have that misunderstanding? It also may have potentially wrong implications for church governance. But again, most importantly in my mind, it excludes the people of Israel from view, and that is just not warranted from looking at the actual biblical terminology used. So if we're going to not use the word church, what alternatives are there in English? Well, Tyndale liked the word congregation. I think that worked very well for him. But what about today? Are there other alternatives that work better today? So congregation, it works well for ecclesia in a certain place. For example, to the congregations of Galatia, to the congregation of God that is in Corinth. That works just fine. I would say today the word congregation does not work very well when you're talking about a universal ecclesia. So, for example, he gave his body for the congregation. You know, the congregation universal, it's weird because the congregation has such a localized idea, in my mind at least. So that would be one potential weakness. What about the word assembly? I think the usage for assembly of Israel in the Old Testament and in those two verses, that's quite natural. That's the way that most English translations translate those terms. It's also a normal word. It's both secular and religious, which matches the Semitic profile of ekklesia. In some ways, the problem, though, is this specifically because of that normal non-religiousness of it. If you just say the assembly, people aren't always going to recognize that you're talking about the assembly of God's people gathered together, the assembly of the disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus. And so, in sometimes you might need to have an extra, phrase like assembly of the Lord, assembly of believers, or assembly of disciples to introduce such a term. We'll talk about that more later. What about other languages? So one interesting one is German. Martin Luther, who predated Tyndale, he looked at ekklesia and he said, well, okay, this isn't a good match for a word like Kirche, which means church and has ideas of a building. Instead, he used the word Gemeinde, which basically means community. And so that much more clearly focuses on the people, but also it's a word that can work for the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, people of God. A lot of languages use a transliteration of ekklesia. So this happened into Latin, which is why the Romance languages all use, Spanish Iglesia, French Église, Igreja in Portuguese. Also, ekklesia got transliterated into languages like Persian, Turkish, Hindi, all have variations of this. I haven't done a semantic analysis of these words, but my guess is that they are not there. They probably have a pretty strong Christian connotation nowadays. They might not work well for the Old Testament or for those two verses that talk about the ecclesia in Moses and David's day. And they might also have connotations of a building. I'm not sure about that. But there's other words that aren't transliterations that still include, they don't easily include Jewish congregations and that have that same problem of disconnect. I would argue in Arabic, the word kanisa has that problem. It's not, you don't see kanisa being used to translate qahal. You don't see kanisa being used to translate in those two verses, except in the Van Dyke actually does have one of them as kanisa. But most modern Arabic translations don't use that, which suggests to me that there's a problem with kanisa as a more general term, which is interesting actually because etymologically it was more general, but by now it seems to have a Christian connotation. What about community in English? You're looking at Gemeinde in German. Well, maybe this can give us a brainstorm idea for English. So community, it clearly refers to people, not building, hierarchy. That's nice. It can function both the Old Testament and New Testament. The community, God's community, the Lord, community of the Lord could work. It's not what we're used to, but it could work. The same weakness of assembly you have with community, you say, okay, and then the community. Well, which community? It also misses the idea of meeting together. The assembly does include. And you'd need to, just like assembly, you need to disambiguate at times, or you just have to expect readers to get used to community as a way of referring to the followers of Jesus. I want to take a step back and just think a little bit about how did we get in this position? Because I think there's an issue with ekklesia that also applies to other many key terms in the New Testament. So you have this general meaning of ekklesia in Greek. Then that word ekklesia gets a specific Christian meaning in Latin, and I think in Persian and Hindi and other languages. So the Latin meaning is then translated into English. It's also inherited straight into the Romance languages. So that more Christian connotation, strongly Christian connotation of the word, was not part of the original ekklesia, but it became through kind of tradition and language change, it ended up into the meaning of this word that gets used to translate the word ekklesia, but maybe doesn't really mean ekklesia anymore. As I said, Arabic is similar. Kanisa used to have more general meaning, like the Knesset in Hebrew is a cognate, but it now has a much more strongly Christian connotation to it. So these terms you could say were inherited, not translated. It's like, you got a first year Greek class and they, what's this word ekklesia? Oh, it means church. And they might learn like later, that it doesn't really mean church in Acts 19 or some other spots, but generally they just kind of equal. You get the gloss. You look at ecclesia and you think church, right? And I think the same thing happens with a lot of other Greek terms. So angelos, diabolos, Christos, paradisos, apostolos, baptizo. These are all terms that like we just kind of have a gloss for it. And we might not think really like, well, what does it actually mean? How does it actually function in Greek at the time? How did it function? Um, and they're not all just specifically religious words, and they're not words maybe that mean quite the same thing as what we think of them today, the glosses that we typically give to them. Um, why does this matter? Well, I would argue that the original in Hebrew and Greek words of the scriptures are God breathed words. They are life and their spirit. And when we translate them in a way that just kind of is based on tradition, blindly following tradition, then and we're ignoring, language change, semantic change, and other things like that, then we're losing elements of the God breathed meaning. That's not good. And it's not the end of the world. I've read English Bibles that have these translations, but you're missing beautiful pieces of the meaning of God's word, and it can lead people into wrong thinking about certain verses and things like that. So it matters because God's word matters, and the meaning is beautiful and rich. And let's try to communicate as much of that richness as we can to our readers. All right. So I want to give you a few examples. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just if you're watching this on video, you can pause and take a look more. But I want to give a few examples of using assembly and community, and you can see for yourselves what you like, what you think maybe needed to be added or something like that. So it says a few verses here, they avoid, if you use a word besides church, then you're going to avoid the literal building idea that church has. So for example, on this rock, I will build my church. Sounds like very architectural, right? Strongly architectural idea. And Jesus was using an architectural metaphor, but it was clearly a metaphor. I build my assembly, build my community. It makes much more clear that he's talking about the people as the building, not just an actual building. Similarly, in First Corinthians, the one who prophesies builds up the assembly as opposed to builds up the church. Maybe that's not as obviously used for a literal idea of a building in people's minds, but still helps. Still helps because that's just not part of the Greek meaning of ekklesia. As I've mentioned, the continuity of the Old Testament and the New Testament use of ekklesia is really important. And some of these verses will give you that sense, like the assembly throughout Judea, Galilee, Samaria, right? That's this kind of thing you might have seen in the Old Testament. The assembly was fervently praying. Okay, be shepherds of God's assembly. I will sing your praises in the assembly. Same thing with community. A lot of these terms could work for community. They're a little more natural, some of them with assembly, because that's what we're used to. Most English readers are used to assembly for kaha. But you could argue both could work. All right. Now, there's also the usage for individual localized ecclesiae, to God's assembly in Corinth, to God's community in Corinth. Okay, you can think about how those work or don't work. You also have the usage for the universal ecclesia, whether to Jews or Greeks or God's assembly. I persecuted God's assembly. God's community. Okay. So also here's a more universal. Christ is the head of the assembly. Christ is the head of the community. We're not used to that. We're used to church. But as I've said, church has other problems with it. Okay, so in summary, let's look at English. We've talked about assembly, congregation, community, and there could be other terms potentially or ways of adding modifiers in when necessary to disambiguate which assembly, which community are we talking about. Spanish, if you look at how typically the word ekklesia is translated in places where the word iglesia is not used, they'll typically use a word like asamblea, congregación, comunidad. And so those are the terms that you might be looking for to potentially replace iglesia for the same reasons or similar reasons as English. French, you've got assemblée, communauté. Those are both terms that are used elsewhere in the New Testament and are also used to translate kahal. In Standard Arabic, you've got the word al-jamia, and that one is also in Lebanese Arabic, the same. So I'm helping on a Lebanese Arabic translation project, and the word Jama' is currently in our draft for Ecclesia. And in another place in Matthew 18, it's got Jama'at al-Mu'minin, which means the gathering of believers, the assembly of believers. Now, I want to bring something up here, which I think is important. So, as I've mentioned, words that are more general match the semantic profile of ekklesia, but they have the disadvantage of at times it's just going to be confusing to readers. Like, what's this ekklesia? What's this Jemea? Which Jemea are we talking about? And so, if there's a need to, or as a desire to disambiguate and to clarify exactly who we're talking about, then one approach would just be to translate that with an additional, modifier, something like Jama'atul Mu'minin. Now, anytime you're going to add a modifier, you have to be careful. What are you potentially modifying? Are you being neutral in what that does to the text? If you added, for example, you could say Jama'at Allah, the assembly of God, and that's a phrase that is used a lot in Greek. It's the God's assembly is used several times in the New Testament. If you always or commonly translate simply ekklesia as God's assembly, let's say, then you may be erasing or at least obscuring the distinction in Greek between simply ekklesia or ekklesia to theou, the assembly of God, let's say. And so that's maybe less than ideal, but it's something you could consider. You could also consider the Lord's assembly. That kind of connects a little more with the Old Testament, although the particular construction, assembly of the Lord is not used as often in the New Testament. Another approach is to say, okay, instead of focusing on who the Jama'ah, who the Ecclesia belongs to, it's who the Ecclesia constitutes, the people. And so that's the approach of Jama'at al-Mu'minin. And it's a defensible approach. I think, however, it's worth asking ourselves the question of, when we use a word like Mu'minin, are we using emic Bible categories, or are we using kind of our own, what we're used to talking about? And there'll be strengths and weaknesses of those approaches. But I'd like to encourage you all to consider what more emic approaches, meaning, what is the Bible, if you're going to talk about the people of God, the people that are constituting the ecclesia, what are the terms that the New Testament typically uses to refer to these people? And so the word believers, or mu'minin, that's you can find that all believers, or held everything in common, pisteontes in Greek. But I think it's only found 2 or 3 times that way. It's not a common way in the New Testament to refer to the people of God. Instead, you much more commonly see mathetes, disciple. That's a very common term in the Gospels, but it also is very common in Acts as well. So post Jesus' resurrection, that disciples idea continues to be used. And it has a little more connotation of following rather than believing. Obviously, believing is a huge part of the Christian faith, but following seems to be a little more emphasized in the terminology itself that's used of the people of God. You also have the word saints, hagioi. That's something that you might want to consider. However you translate that, you might say Jemet, Qadusin. I might have gotten that one wrong. But so Jemet Tamis would be the assembly of the disciples. Something like that might make more sense, potentially. This is something that we're just in the beginning of exploring in our project. But for your languages, whether it's English or another language you're thinking about, don't assume that just the most common idea that comes to your head for a modifier to disambiguate ekklesia is necessarily most neutral from a biblical terminology perspective. So I hope that you've enjoyed thinking through the translation of ekklesia. I hope I've convinced you that church is not a great translation. And even though we're really used to it, it's our tradition. We're used to what we have, but maybe for the next generation, we can get something better. And for translations, new translations into languages that don't have a translation yet, do we want to saddle them with the wrong connotations, the wrong ideas, and the missing meaning of an inherited tradition? Or can we find a way to actually translate ekklesia in what it actually means in Greek and how it actually functions in the New Testament, as well as looking at how it connects to the Old Testament usage? Thank you very much.